Hi, I'm Randall from Randall's ESL Cyber Listening Lab, providing tips on language learning, culture, and human development. And I think creating a positive learning environment, no matter what situation that might be, in a home, in a school, with friends, I think is really rewarding, but it can be challenging to do, especially when we find ourselves in this pandemic today. And I think I always ask myself, with my students and with my children, how can you meet their intellectual, emotional, and physical needs? Well, throughout my career, that spans more than 30 years, I think I've made numerous mistakes and missteps along the way. And over time, I've learned to try to recognize those mistakes and embrace my imperfections as I've learned to become a better teacher, hopefully a better friend, and a better father. So today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on this particular topic of human connection and fostering an emotionally healthy learning environment at home and at school. We have someone else. Powell, thank you for joining us. Thank you very much. And I think this is an important topic for all of us. Well, let's get right into this. The ideas that I'm sharing today really span 30 years. And I think some of the most important lessons I've learned over the last few. And some of the ideas that you're hearing today, I've shared at different conferences, at different presentations. This past week, I was an invited speaker to the Human Values Conference in Mexico. It was a wonderful experience to listen to different people talking about how we can connect, how can we create emotionally friendly, healthy environments. Well, you see in the picture, this is my grandson. His name is Odin. And over the years, I've tried to think back. What can I do to improve the relationship with my kids, with my grandkids, and so forth? And to here are some pictures. We went camping together. We enjoy bike riding together. And a few years ago, my daughter Emily asked me, what do I want for Christmas? And I said, all I want is peace, love, and understanding. And what she did is she surprised me. This actual board is actually in my bedroom. It's hanging on the wall to remind me of the importance of peace, love, and understanding. And this kind of leads into the topic that I'm going to be sharing today. And I want to think of some warm-up questions to get us started. So as I mentioned before, I'm talking about mistakes. So throughout the broadcast, feel free to share any of the learning experiences that you have had and those elements that have broadened, expanded your relationships with your students and your family and your children. So first of all, I want to ask you 3 questions. Question number 1 is, how many of you have made at least one mistake? Now, I can't see you, but I'm assuming some of you would be raising your hands. The next question is, how many of you would say, I wish I could go back in time and erase those mistakes? I'm sure some of us would say yes. And the next question is would you, even if I paid you, and some of you might say this, hey, Randall, I wouldn't discuss some of my mistakes with the person next to me, the person in my house, a teacher that I work with, some of my students, even if you paid me $100. So one of the things, I think mistakes are sometimes really difficult to talk about. Pierre, thank you. Happy to hear from you. And again, for everyone that is watching today, feel free to share your comments. So as I open this presentation, I'd like to share with you and ask you these questions. What do human values and meaningful human connection mean to you? What does it look like to you? And what relationship would you like to improve today? So what relationship? And I'm hoping that at the end of the presentation, at our discussion, and again, I like to make this a live broadcast where people are able to share their opinions on what human connection looks like, what does it entail, and so forth. So as I think about these questions, I have some additional questions to think about. Number 1, what is the biggest challenge and greatest reward in establishing meaning connections with each other? What are those rewards? And I must say that in the beginning, sometimes the way that we see the world through the glasses of our own experience. And so that sometimes colors how we view things as well. So the purpose of my presentation, my thoughts today, again, joining with you today is number one, I'd like to examine 6 of the greatest mistakes that I've made as a parent and as an educator, and the successes that I have made along the way. Now, certainly I'm talking and not a unfiltered vulnerability. I'm just sharing those mistakes that I think are of greatest interest and value to people like you. And feel free to share those mistakes that you've had as well. So let's get into this. As I talk about 6 keys, I'm not just talking about, when I think about 6 keys, I'm not just talking about, all of these keys would be relevant to every environment around the world. No, some of the ideas that I'm sharing today might be relevant to certain cultural environments and others not. So I'm keeping that in mind. So the key number 1, I realize, again, talking with students and family relationships and with children and so forth, I realize I could be wrong about so many things and not even know it. Now, what do you mean by this? And some of the ideas I'm sharing today, I've shared on other broadcasts. I'm kind of bringing those together in this presentation. But one of the things that I want to share with you, there was a landmark study by 2 psychologists, Daniel Simons and Chris Chabris, and in 1999, and they were building upon the research of other people beforehand. But what they did is they videoed 2 teams, a group of people in white shirts and a group of people in black shirts. And what they did is they had each team pass the basketball to each other. After they did the video, then they asked those participating in the study to count the number of times that the white team passed to each other. It was a very, very, very short video. And then after the video, then they asked those that were participating in the study what they saw. And so many people said, I saw 14 passes, 15 passes, 16 passes, and so forth. But one of the things that they didn't see, over 50% of the people did not see the woman dressed up in a gorilla suit pass in front of the camera, beat her chest, and then walk off. And she spent about 9 seconds in the video. But only about 50% of the students or the participants actually saw it. Those that didn't see it were amazed. Now, there was nothing there. And those that saw it, but when they heard of other people that didn't see it, kind of exclaimed, "How in the world did you not see that gorilla?" Well, the focus of the study was called inattentional blindness. Sometimes when we're so focused on one thing right in front of us, sometimes we miss things right before our eyes. Now, how is that related to relationships and so forth? Well, what I'd like to do is our life dilemma is this. We are often so unaware of how unaware we are in our home, in our family, in our relationships. We think we see the world exactly how it is, and the rest of the world does not. I mean, we hang on to certainty. Well, one of the things that I find is there's a certain lack of awareness and the illusion of knowledge, which I think is important to say. And so one of the things that you want to keep in mind with anything that we're talking about is that sometimes we're so unaware. Let me give you an example of the illusion of knowledge. A number of years ago, my daughter Emily was working with this horse. You can actually see the picture of the horse right behind me. The horse is named Otis. And this Otis, no one wanted to ride this horse. He seemed to have a real ornery attitude. He kicked people, just stayed away from people. And if you were afraid of him, he could sense that. Well, over time, my daughter realized one of the things that she realized is this horse, Otis, had been abused. And so as she started to know a little bit more about the horse, then she was able to develop a relationship with the horse. Did she ever get kicked? Yes, she got kicked. But the one thing is talking about the illusion of knowledge. When we see a friend, when we see a teenager, when we see a family member, and they seem a little aloof, not interested in what we have to say, seems a little disconnected, sometimes we have to ask ourselves why. It's kind of like the idea, well, if you, for example, are a teacher and you're in a classroom and you have a student that just is sleeping and you're wondering, oh, they must be playing video games all night. And then we realize that there must be something going on in their life. Instead, for example, or like on Zoom, you're teaching a class, or there are other students in class, and they have their video cameras turned off. And we make the assumption maybe they're sleeping, and maybe they are, but maybe something else is going on in their life that we're not aware of. Maybe, for example, their father has COVID-19. Maybe they have a family member in the hospital. And so all of these things are so important to realize of how unaware we are. And one of my favorite thoughts is this, is that the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. In other words, we're so blind to the things in front of us. So my learning keys to this is, number one of my favorite books is called Being Wrong. And sometimes being wrong and acknowledging that we're missing something can be really difficult. The author, Karen Scholl, said, however disconcerting, all right, disorienting, difficult, humbling our mistakes might be, it is ultimate wrongness, not rightness, that teaches who we really are. And so as I think of the application, going back to the theme of human connection, number one, we need to accept the limitations and boundaries of our knowledge on any subject. And the other thing is, I think we need to become more humble and open to new ideas and our lack of awareness, because I think that's hard. And I think for me, the mistake is that when I was wrong, sometimes it was it was difficult to acknowledge that I was wrong and that I needed to change. I needed to see the world in a little different way. And I think that is really important. Again, we have Nayeli, good morning, and greeting from Israel. Again, thank you very much for joining this important topic. So let's go on then to the next point. The next point is being authentic and vulnerable. We talk a lot about authenticity, I think, in our societies today, be authentic. But the reality is, what does that mean to be truly authentic? What does that mean? And so one of the things that I want to look at right now is, and I've used this example many, many times. Often someone might ask me, what was your college major? And I'm going to show you. It's right in the middle of the screen. Take a look right there. And my major was Spanish education. And you might say, well, why would you be afraid to even talk about that? And one of the things is that I feel a little bit vulnerable. In other words, my Spanish is not perfect, far from perfect, but it's really hard to acknowledge our limitations and who we really are. So one of the things, even as a language teacher, when you hear students ask you these questions, teacher, what is the difference between lay and lie and whom, and compliment and every day? And sometimes as teachers, being afraid to acknowledge our limitations and imperfections, sometimes we might do this. Oh, lie and lay, that's something we cover in level 29 grammar. We're so afraid to acknowledge some of those imperfections rather than simply saying, that's a really good question. Tomorrow, I'm going to bring that answer. I'm going to spend time finding that answer. And at the beginning of class, we're going to talk about that. So why are we so restricted? Why are we so afraid? Well, it's fear. I think a lot of times in human connections, we often worry that maybe people will see me differently. Maybe they'll see me imperfect. And one of the things is that we allow sometimes people that are sitting in the stands of life to determine our self-worth and our, dignity. And I think that's kind of important there. Also, there is, again, from Israel, our brain is not designed to learn so many things at the same time. I think that's true. Sometimes we're trying to balance everything in our lives. And another greetings from Toronto. Thank you very much. So what do we do? What does this look like? Well, I think sometimes as human beings, especially when we're trying to impress people, to make people see that we're whole, sometimes one of my favorite quotes is, we wear out our lives trying to be someone who we are not. We pretend to be someone who we aren't, and we pretend to know what we don't. In other words, the picture that you see me that in this is I'm cooking spaghetti at home, and this is me. This is the real me, all right? But I really would like to be able to do this. I would really like to be able to dunk the basketball. But sometimes we just need to acknowledge who we really are. Or I'd like to be able to do this, all right? So one of my favorite books, and this comes from Brené Brown. She's a researcher on vulnerability, shame, and courage at the University of Houston. She has written a number of books, The Gifts of Imperfection, Daring Greatly. And she identifies, why is it so difficult to be vulnerable to our students in other relationships and so forth. And I've heard teachers say to me, Randall, I would like to open up and share some difficult experiences with my students, but I'm afraid of how they might view me. Well, one of the things I think many of us live our lives in fear, the fear of looking weak, flawed, and imperfect, says Brené Brown. And we wear, you could say, a mask or glasses of inauthenticity. We hide behind a facade so people cannot see who we really are, again, because of fear. But the reality, Brené Brown says, is that vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. So as I think about this particular topic, and in one of her books, it's called The Gifts of Imperfection, she says, authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. And so I always encourage people to surround yourself with people who make you feel complete and whole just the way you are. And that's the same thing with children. Children want to see that, yes, maybe you have a soft side. Maybe there are times when you cry, when you struggle, especially during this pandemic where so much of our life has been impacted economically, socially. There's nothing wrong with opening up to people. So what is the purpose of this kind of authenticity with relationships? Tasteful vulnerability. I'm not saying that you tell people every single secret in your life, not at all. But I think authenticity, number one, builds honest and real connections with people, and it attracts real people because you can often see who is pretending and who isn't. And authenticity helps you wear the same face. You're the same person no matter what your situation in life. And I think those comments and ideas are really important. Fear and anxiety divert the subject. Yeah, sometimes we have fear and we don't want to talk about the topic at all. And Michael is sharing a comment. I like that quote. Thank you very much, Michael. And Michael is actually my son. I appreciate him participating in the broadcast. That idea of authenticity, I think, is so key to what we're talking about today. All right, so let's go on to the next point. And again, I think if any of my children are watching, they would probably say, oh yeah, my dad. Yeah, there was a time when he lacked that authenticity, the ability to connect, and they would probably say, hey, he's trying to do that. So what is the next point? The next point deals with this. And the next point I want to talk about is creating a clear path for children, for human beings to follow. And what does that actually look like? Well, first of all, when I think of it, and this was actually a statement that came from a student as I was giving this broadcast this past week. What is the most common mistake of a teacher when teaching? And this is by Pablo. And I think one of probably the most difficult comments is something like this, is that sometimes in families, with children, with students, we tell them, the goal is to get to the other side. And the question is, without being able to see the other side, without establishing clear boundaries, clear expectations and goals, sometimes we miss completely. It's kind of like when I was in high school. Let me give you an example. When I was in high school, sometimes I think teachers and parents and friendships, sometimes we create unnecessary ambiguity. Sometimes we say, like my teacher in high school, when I said, "What is on the test?" And the teacher would say, "That's for me to know." And that really doesn't help anyone. Same thing with a parent, right? If a parent says something like, "Oh, clean your room," and the child says politely, "Oh, why?" "Because I'm your parent." And instead of explaining things, explaining the reason for it, maybe you need to clean the room because we have visitors that are going to be seeing our house and they might want to take a tour of some of the rooms, who knows? But certainly that's important. The other ideas, let me share with you an example from high school. In high school, I was taking Spanish, and I think what is really common in many classrooms is where you have a teacher gives students a dialogue, the students stand up, they read the dialogue, and then the teacher gives them a grade. And that's what we did, me and my friend. So after the dialogue, the teacher said, "Okay, Randall, you got an 8 out of a 10. But you, Johnny, got 8.5 out of 10. Now you might say, for me, it was like, "Well, teacher, what is the difference between an 8 and an 8.5 or a 7 and a 7.2 or whatever?" Sometimes as teachers, we create these artificial, let's say, scales that are really difficult to quantify. In other words, what is if your students are reading something and they make some mistakes or something like that? How do you quantify between an 8 and an 8.5, a 9 and a 9.5? You might have a system, but you want to make sure that's really clear to your students. Really important there. Okay, so same thing with systems. So, sometimes we have scales of 0 to a 10, or like even growing up, our children, we had a level system where they had 0, 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure my kids could, mention that. And we tried to lay out what each level meant, but sometimes it might have been ambiguous. And sometimes that's one of the dangers that we have to be careful of. Nayeli from Mexico says, "You are a perfect example of authenticity. You always show the real you in your broadcast posts and pictures." Well, certainly what we do is we certainly try to. I don't think that in any way I'm perfect on that. And I think, again, if my children were to hear you say that, they would say, "Oh, my dad." But I think they would say, "I'm trying. I'm certainly trying." Carolina says, "Hi, Randall, from Mexico. Love this topic. My emotional intelligence students loved it as well." And again, I want to thank Carolina for inviting me to the Human Values Conference this week in Mexico. And perhaps, Carolina, you can share the actual link to that Facebook page so people can go back and watch the entire conference. I think it was great. So, what's next? Well, the next point is, so we've talked about, number one, being aware of how unaware we are. And I think, let me step back. There were times, for example, even with my children where, I thought I understood what they were feeling. I thought I understood from my experience. But then sometimes they realize, "Dad, you're not getting it. You don't understand me." And the reality is, I'm not in their head. As much as I want to be, as much as I really want to understand, I think the next concepts after this point number 4 will show you some of the things that we can all do. Well, the next point I have is point number 4 out of point number 6 is establishing logical consequences for behavior. Now, what does that mean, for example? Sometimes we come up with logical consequences for certain behaviors and so forth, but not just punishments, which tend to demean. Now, what do I mean by this idea right here? And let me share what here. Sometimes we need to come up with logical consequences, not illogical ones. And I can give you an example. When I was in 3rd grade, of course, the rule was of no chewing gum, but I thought I could get away with chewing gum. I mean, the teacher would never see. And so I put a piece of gum in my mouth, just quietly chewing the gum. And then eventually the teacher caught me, made me take the gum out of my mouth, put it on my nose, and stand in the corner of the room for a very long time. And for me, that was totally demeaning. I mean, friends snickering, laughing, and so forth. There was another time when I did the same thing, but another teacher made me stay in while the other children went outside, and I actually cleaned under the desk all the chewing gum that other kids had left. Now, that is more of a logical consequence. So, and in regards to this, let's look at some examples. What do I mean by logical and illogical consequence? Well, first of all, if children are playing outside and they track mud into the house, well, they clean it up. That is a logical consequence, all right? If a student sleeps in class, you take a picture of him or her and then put it on Instagram to embarrass him. That's illogical. And so what we want to certainly do is, with our relationships, with our family, with the students and so forth, come up with logical consequences for anything. Because I promise you, if you have some type of illogical consequence and it demeans someone, you've lost the connection completely. So, what can we do for logical consequences as teachers, as parents, as family? Number one, make your policies and expectations and grading clear for students if you're a teacher. And if you're a parent, make sure whatever things that you do, for example, if your children come home late with the car, saying, well, you can't eat ice cream, that's not a logical consequence, right? For example, if you've taken the car without permission, a logical consequence would be you don't drive it next time. And so those are, I think, are really important. The next point I want to talk about is expressing deep compassion for others. These, I think, are extremely important during this period of COVID-19, where so many people are struggling with sickness, with just the impact economically. And so right now, and some of you have seen this picture before, maybe some of you haven't, but when you look at this picture, what do you see? Well, most people will say, I saw a tiger, but the question is, how many tigers did you see? Now look again. Now I know you're looking carefully, where is that hidden tiger? But if you look in the stripes of the tiger, it says the hidden tiger. And so how does this relate to human connection? Well, I think there's sometimes when parents misunderstand students, teachers misunderstand their students, parents misunderstand their children, their feelings, their perceptions, their beliefs, and so forth when they struggle in home, in the relationships, and so forth. And I think this is really important. And as part of this presentation that I gave this past week, several students sent me some of these questions. Why do you think bullying has increased in recent years? Do you think it is necessary to have an extra class where students can express their emotions? And do you think all teachers listen to their students? And I would simply say also, do you think all parents listen to their children? And do all children listen to their parents? No. And one of the things, as you see about bullying, and I could spend a whole episode talking about the impact of bullying in our own family with our own children. Certainly, that can be really traumatic. Well, one of the things that we want to be careful when, and going back to that hidden tiger, sometimes, as I mentioned, back to point number one, we're so unaware of how unaware we are. Sometimes this unawareness leads us to stereotypical attitudes. For example, okay, you know how students are from Reynosa. Reynosa is a city in Mexico. It could be Tokyo. It could be Seoul. It could be New York. Sometimes we pigeonhole or label people in that way. Okay, the most effective teachers are the ones that use technology. Sometimes I hear this comment from teachers. Or another comment is this, right? That student is just lazy and can't bother to do the work. Those types of stereotypes based in the idea of, number one, going back to the invisible gorilla, that's called inattentional blindness, and our ability to not see sometimes lead us to tragic feelings and comments about others. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that, and that should say iceberg there are certain behaviors that we see, like a student self-isolating. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, a student turning off their camera during a Zoom meeting. A child staying in the room or self-isolating or not wanting to be together with family. So one of the things we have to ask ourselves, maybe some of the things that we do not see are anxiety, depression, or emotional trauma. So throughout the broadcast, feel free to share. We've talked a little bit about being so unaware, authenticity. Feel free to share any comments about the importance of authenticity. I've talked about setting clear expectations and goals. I certainly would be interested in hearing your story and a little bit more about that. So I think these are all important. Here's another comment that's coming in. Some of my friends try to blow a bubble and then it explodes all over his face and then the entire class is laughing. And so yes, that kind of mocking other people I think is really unfortunate to see. Well, one of the things that I've shared, I'm going to do this really briefly. I've shared in other broadcasts a little bit about my son, Joshua. He was really into technology. He really enjoyed, tinkering with things. But over a 10-year period, he struggled with depression, bipolar disorder. He was in the hospital 12 times, and eventually he died by suicide. And one of the things that I bring this up is that sometimes for many people, his struggles were beyond what people could understand, and some people often made simplistic assumptions and ideas. Just get over it. Just go for a walk, when we don't realize that going back to the idea of depression sometimes can be very, very deep indeed. So a learning experience, sometimes as you see people that are struggling, again, going back to the whole idea of building human connection, healthy learning environments, both at school and at home. Number one, try to avoid the idea of competing sympathies. Now, Rand, what do you mean with this? So, for example, let's say that I had a student one time that his grandfather passed away. And I expressed my sympathy. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. And I was about to say, I understand how you feel. But then I realized sometimes we don't want to say, I know how you feel, because maybe my grandfather, who I might have seen a couple of times a year, maybe his grandfather was the one that raised him. So there was a quite different relationship. So anytime we try to use what I call competing sympathies, we really disconnect from the other person. We actually are focusing on our own selves because of discomfort. We don't know what to say, rather than focusing on the individual. So one of the things that I think is really important, I've spoken about this before also, is about the golden rule. And sometimes we often talk about, well, we should follow the golden rule. We find this kind of phrase, this kind of belief across all kinds of religious and faith and cultural traditions. But the idea of treating others the way that we want to be treated really is an egocentric model. In other words, I'm going to treat you the way I want you to treat me. And it really is focusing on us. So instead, perhaps we should be doing this. Treat others the way that they want to be treated. So we're focusing on their needs, not the way that we want to be treated. And I think this type of compassion really opens up those new windows. So going back to the theme today of establishing a healthy family, a classroom environment, is sometimes we should be asking ourselves, I'm going to focus on your needs, your situation, your story first, and then I will treat the way you want to be. Now, Randall, how has this been a mistake for you? Well, certainly I generally use that golden rule. Oh, really? I see that you're struggling. I struggle too. And then a lot of people, they don't want to hear that. They want you to focus on that, and they want you to listen deeply. And that, I think, is really important. Well, one of my favorite talks, one of my favorite spiritual leaders, is the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh from Vietnam. And he said the following, and this could apply to any situation, but he said the following. He says, deep listening is the kind of listening that helps you relieve the suffering of another person. You can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose: to help him or her empty their heart. Empty, to allow them to empty their heart. And he goes on, he says, because you know that listening like this, you give that person a chance to suffer less. Even if he's made a mistake, even if you don't agree with his perception, even if you don't agree with his position on things, allowing someone to empty their heart, I think, is really a critical point in any human relation, especially with students. So what is the application of these ideas in relationship to students and friends and family? Number one, you should try to learn about others and validate their perspectives and struggles, even if you don't agree with them. Sit and listen, and as I just mentioned from Thich Nhat Hanh, allow them to empty their heart. Now, will that conversation be hard? Yes, it can be. May they say something that you disagree with? Yeah, that could happen. Could it be something that could hurt your feelings? Possibly. Or challenge your feelings as well. But I think that's important. And the other thing is just sitting with people in their discomfort, allowing them to release that emotional energy that is often beyond your awareness. So that, I think, is really important for me. The last point I want to talk is about daring greatly. Daring greatly. And what do you mean by daring greatly? And how has that been a mistake for you? The idea of daring greatly often deals with, as I mentioned, acknowledging your mistakes, being authentic, coming up with clear and logical consequences, showing clear expectations, and having that deep compassion. Well, sometimes these conversations with people, with family, with friends can really be uncomfortable. And sometimes it's much easier to talk about, oh, you have a moving van in front of your house. Where are you going? Than asking and approaching someone who has lost a family member. Let's say to COVID-19, or someone is deeply struggling emotionally. Someone has lost a family member. Sometimes we're really afraid of that type of conversation. And one of the things that I think about daring greatly, let me just share with you, one of the things that I really enjoy is running. I enjoy running in the mountains, especially trail running, not so much interested in running on the streets. But in one event, I was running with our son Michael and my wife. We were participating in this trail event, running along a trail, and I fell. I tripped over I think it was a tree stump, a small little stump, a root in the trail. I fell and I hit the ground really hard. I got back up and I started running again, and I tripped over another rock and fell and hit hard. And then I told my wife to continue on because I realized my watch that was on my wrist was no longer there. It must have gotten ripped off. So I went back and I found it. But as I was running back to the finish line, my son met me. Of course, he was way ahead of me. But I started to feel something in my toe. My toe was really hurting. So I took off my shoe and I saw that my toe was bleeding. It was bleeding there, and I took off my toe. And again, a warning here, okay, is that it almost literally ripped off my toenail. But one of the things I learned from that experience is that, I think I could have I wanted to continue to run. It was a really painful experience. But the next week, my wife and I decided to run a marathon. And I could have said, I can't, my toe hurts. But what I tried to do is accommodate, change, dare greatly, do something that might be uncomfortable or different. So what I did is I took my running shoe and I cut off the top of the running shoe so that my toe could breathe. It was still oozing. It wasn't in the best shape, but I was able to complete that marathon the next week. But the idea of doing something, daring greatly, I think is one of the things that I've learned over time. And so what I'd like to end with the broadcast today is just share a couple of last comments related to this. As number one of my favorite comments is, and again, we've all made mistakes, is that mistakes are the bridge between experience and wisdom. And a lot of times we don't want to make mistakes because how painful they might be. But mistakes, I think, are the pathways to personal growth and they can be painful to look at, to examine up closely, but I think they lead to greater understanding. I think they lead to greater compassion for other people as well. Well, I want to thank you for joining the broadcast today. I talked again about how to create a healthy learning environment, both at home and at school. And certainly I am imperfect in these ways, but I think, as I mentioned, I think the gateway to becoming better is actually the ability, as I mentioned, seeing that hidden gorilla, the invisible gorilla. You can actually go to a website called invisiblegorilla.com, being able to see that gorilla and that hidden tiger. So anytime you're in a relationship, you're meeting people as a student, as a parent, as a friend, and you see something that might not quite be right, that someone is maybe struggling, dare to do something greatly. Step into discomfort. Step into a situation where this person might need to empty their heart for me to listen to them. I want to thank you very much for joining the broadcast today. As always, your voice, your comments are what make this broadcast interesting and useful for people around the world. I want to wish you a very wonderful day and an even better tomorrow.